I'd like to go back to a question that was asked a moment ago about oil prices. And one of the statements that you said, and this is a quote, your job is to make sure high oil prices doesn't spill over into higher inflation. Could you expound on how the Federal Reserve makes sure that it doesn't spill over?
So let me qualify this. Clearly, higher oil price in the short run does spill over into inflation. But it's very important to understand that the Federal Reserve and any central bank can't determine what's going to happen in inflation in the very short run when there are shocks, because our policies take a fairly long time to have an impact on the economy on the order of several years, particularly in terms of inflation. So what this means is that we actually have to look far out and ask, will this shock to oil prices have a potential effect on inflation further out? And if it does, what are we going to do about it? This is one of the reasons why even though an oil price shock may have temporary effects on inflation, you have to make sure that those temporary impacts on inflation don't spill over into long-term impacts on inflation. And this is why it's so important that the Federal Reserve make it clear that we will do what we need to make sure that inflation in the long run is going to stay stable. That's an incredibly important part of our mandate. The great success of central banks throughout the world, and the Federal Reserve has been a leader in this, has been our focus on price stability. That was not always as true 30 years ago. And in fact, not only did that mean that we had high and variable inflation, which made it very difficult for firms to plan and actually hurt small businesses in exactly that way, but it actually led to an economy that underperformed in terms of economic activity and in terms of producing jobs. So in this context, we really do carefully monitor what happens to oil prices, we try to make our best guesses about what might happen in the future, but actually respond to information as it comes in, but always have this long-run perspective. And this is why it's very important not to, for example, overreact to a rise in oil prices, but actually to think about what is the impact in a longer-run context and then take exactly the steps that will, in fact, create an environment which is one which is successful both on the inflation front and on the output front.
I think I hear you say that part of your job is forecasting.
Oh, it's a big part of our job, absolutely.
And with that being said, where are you in your forecasting now in the foreseeable future?
Well, we've actually talked about this in the statement that we made after our last FOMC meeting. Clearly, there's an issue of potentially slower growth in the short term, but in fact, we see moderate growth in a longer-term horizon. And of course, having the right monetary policy is part of getting that to happen. And indeed, a reason why, in fact, we felt the need to lower interest rates by 0.75 of a percentage point was, in fact, to ensure that the economy would actually keep growing at a moderate pace, and felt that we could do that and actually not have a negative consequences on inflation, because the nature of the inflation numbers have come in favorably in recent months, and also that the situation in the overall economy, the balance of supply and demand, indicates that we hope that inflation will not rise in the future. But this is something that we have to really keep our eye on. So the difficult problem for central bankers, and maybe we actually need 5 hands to think about this, but we actually have to really balance these risks. And unfortunately, we don't have a crystal ball, but the Federal Reserve has actually been quite strong in its forecasting operation. One of the great pleasures for me, having come on the Federal Reserve about a year ago, is to interact with our staff and the extraordinary capability of our staff, which has been very strong in terms of thinking about where the economy might be heading, and giving us a perspective which I think has enabled us to do pretty well in terms of the setting of policy instruments. So this is part of what makes central banking interesting. There's a lot of science in central banking, but there's also a lot of art as well. And I think so far we've been doing pretty well on this, but it's a tough job.
Let me change the question just a little bit. With small business being the backbone of our economy, the job creator in our economy, could you talk about, as small business owners go out to find those loans, the increase in credit card debt among small businesses and what effect it's having on small businesses?
there has been a substantial increase in the use of credit cards by small businesses. But what we found is that actually most small businesses are using it for transaction purposes, so that it's much easier to use a credit card. In fact, when I go in the store, I don't like to carry change, so I use a credit card for very small purchases. It doesn't always make me very popular with the store owner, but that's what I do. Small businesses finding this an important tool for them. It is not the main a main source for them in terms of their financing, because they find that there are other sources of financing that are cheaper. So the credit cards do have an important role here. There are firms, particularly sometimes startup firms, you hear stories about them starting up their firm in a garage and they borrow with their credit card, and in many of those cases actually help them to become successful. But clearly, because credit card debt is not usually the cheapest form of debt for small firms, that they actually seek out other sources of financing and have been able over the years to be pretty successful at getting it. And in fact, this sector has been an incredibly important engine of growth in the U.S. economy.
One last question. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Community Reinvestment Act, the CRA, which doesn't require banks to lend to small business, but it does encourage. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, clearly one of the things as a result of the Community Reinvestment Act that in fact banks do worry about the communities that they serve. And in that context, it's not only dealing with households, which is what the Act tells them to do, that they also actually have outreach to small businesses as well. And it is a very important issue in terms of these communities. It's not good enough just to lend to households. Wealth generation and wealth creation is frequently coming and typically coming from businesses, and small businesses can play a very important role in these communities. So that banks actually do, in fact, try to reach out to these communities. And, in fact, I think the Community Reinvestment Act, by getting them to think about this in terms of households, has also helped them to think about it also in terms of small businesses as well. The one thing that should be said is that there is an interaction between households and small businesses. In fact, sometimes they're the same thing because, you have a little business. I actually had something that I set up for a while and then actually got rid of it. But I, at one point, was a corporation. So when there was only one person in the corporation, it was me. And so clearly this issue of worrying about households actually means also that you worry about, indirectly worry about small businesses as well.